Welcome into another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I am your host, Graham Hall, joined by Jacob Rudner. And if you listen to Monday's episode when Blake Alderman and I sat down to discuss the upcoming official visit for Cormani McClain, we talked about how Florida was certainly a potential landing spot for him, if not the favorite to pick up his services after he entered the transfer portal after 1 year at Colorado. And as of today, Wednesday, May 15th, he is the newest member of the Florida Gators. He took an official visit, arrived in Gainesville on Tuesday, which was his second visit to Florida's campus in under a week. And he left that visit having committed to Florida's coaching staff. It really is, I think, an impressive addition. A low-risk, high-reward move was how I called it on Monday. And that's still how I look at this addition. And Jacob, we'll just jump right into it. From scouting Cormani and looking at Florida's roster, what do you make of this addition? How do you think he fits in to this Florida roster for the 2024 season and beyond, of course?
I mean, Graham, there's no denying his potential on the field. This is a kid who was a former five-star prospect, and there's been a lot made of what he's done off the field and how that's impacted his career. I think anybody who's familiar with Cormani McClain's collegiate progression so far is probably familiar with the fact that he and Dion Sanders seem to, kind of rub each other the wrong way, perhaps you could say. And Dion Sanders was unafraid to essentially state publicly that he wished Cormani was more bought into the processes required to be a good football player and to show up to certain meetings and to pay better attention and to learn scheme and spend more time doing those things at Colorado. And as true as those things may have been, and I think Florida anticipates being able to work with him on those things and be able to kind of iron some of those items out and make him a more well-rounded football player. I would be remiss not to say that this is a superstar. I mean, Cormani McClain is a five-star prospect. He was viewed as the best cornerback in the 2023 cycle. He's incredibly athletic. He was able to play wide receiver and corner, recorded over 30 interceptions as a high school player. Is really good in space, does a great job in coverage, and is an extremely talented player. So in terms of the impact or the potential impact of Florida's addition here, I think it's massive. And this is a guy like any other five-star prospect who we would be sitting down on this podcast and saying it's a great win on the recruiting front. Florida's roster from a skill and potential standpoint is better than it was a day ago at this time. And now it's just a matter of whether or not Florida is able to work on some of those things that I mentioned that Dion Sanders publicly mentioned and see if it can, turn potential into reality. And I think as much of that will have to occur off the field as it will on the field. But providing that those things can be accomplished over time, I really do believe that Florida added a superstar to its roster at a minimum for this upcoming 2024 season. The depth at the position is better. I think that this is somebody who is capable of playing right away. If his habits improve off the field, and again, if that all happens, just a massive win for Billy Napier and his staff.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Dion Sanders' comments, because if you missed what I said on Monday's episode, go check out the end of that episode where I discussed what to make of Dion Sanders' public admonishment in a sense of a guy who wasn't able to arrive as an early enrollee, and yet he still is kind of thrust due to the overhaul of Colorado's roster into this contributing role where he, ends up starting in 4 games last season, didn't really have an opportunity to hone in on his physical development when he got to Boulder. And due to, like I said, how many people left that program, he was counted on in year 1. And it was just kind of shocking to me to see Dion Sanders' comments talking about missing meetings and being on time for meetings and airing a player out publicly, because you would think that as a former player, Sanders would understand that this is someone that, one, you should protect, especially in this day and age, because you don't want to be publicly criticizing players, because that's going to rub future talent the wrong way, knowing that if they come into a program and do 1-2 things wrong, maybe some things that aren't even their fault, that they're going to be publicly criticized by a head coach. And I wondered and speculated if that was something that maybe contributed to the lack of suitors for Cormani McClain once he entered the transfer portal, because it really did seem like this was only a couple teams that were in the mix, and especially, just teams in the state of Florida. USF was mentioned, UCF was mentioned, but really it became clear that Florida had an inside track on going after Cormani McClain, and maybe that had to do a little bit with how highly recruited he was by the Florida program when he was a prospect. I certainly think that is certainly a factor here, but you would expect some programs from around the country to at least, kick the tires a little bit more, whether, even a national championship program like Michigan, I would have expected maybe just knowing what they could have used. You never know. Ohio State, Notre Dame, you name it. Getting a player of this caliber, a former 5-star prospect who certainly we don't know what he could, pan out to be, what his potential may be. I think that it was kind of a lost year for him at Colorado. You're really getting someone who, I hate to say he's been humbled in a sense, but I think that he probably is very hungry. His former coach comes out and writes him off, and he doesn't really get an opportunity to showcase what he's capable of. It was a really interesting situation to me that maybe Dion Sanders' comments impacted how few teams were going after him. But, one program's trash is someone else's treasure. And I think that Florida may have benefited a little bit here from Dion Sanders making it appear as if Cormani McClain was someone who didn't have his head on straight when he got to the college level. That I think that certainly may have helped them. From the people I've talked to, they were surprised at Dion Sanders' comments, and I just don't really see that too often. I think it speaks more about Colorado and Coach Sanders than it does about Cormani McClain. What did you make of just, what he said about Cormani McClain? And are you in the same boat as me that I think that we could say that Florida has a little bit more veteran leadership, more experienced players that are going to, and certainly more resources that are going to, I think, allow Cormani to thrive at a higher level here and maybe keep him in line a little bit more, so that there's no being late to meetings, there's no missing meetings, there's not going to be a chance for him to be thrust into action when he doesn't understand the scheme. Do you agree with me on that front?
Look, I mean, I don't know that I'm in a position to be able to confidently comment on the situation over at Colorado. And here's the reality. I think that publicly there's been a lot made of how Dion Sanders handles his program. I'm certain that rubs people the wrong way, both from a fan perspective, but also from a player perspective. Maybe even other programs don't necessarily agree with his methods, but that's how Colorado does things. And I'm not, plugged in enough with that program to really be able to say whether or not they didn't have the facilities, and I'm talking, resources, not tangible facilities, to be able to foster Cormani McClain's growth. I don't know. But what I can say is that Florida is quite confident that it has the ability to do those things. Whether or not Colorado could do so is irrelevant. I think that Florida views itself as a matured program. Florida views itself as a program that is in a better spot than it was 3 years ago when Billy Napier took over the program, in order to be able to take kids like Cormani McClain, who may have somewhat of a checkered past or might not have the best habits off the field, and bring them in and really help them mature and grow, and to teach them the lessons and the tools necessary in order to be as successful as possible. And Billy Napier has talked about this very publicly, how he feels as though his more experienced roster, his improved processes, his team culture are all things that lend themselves to growth at the individual level. And so I think that Florida is confident that Cormani McClain will not be an exception to this, that they can bring him in and they can help him improve both on and off the field, and to really hone in that focus in order to be able to accomplish those things. And I'll add one more thing here. I do think that there's some incentive that exists at Florida for Cormani McClain that maybe didn't exist at Colorado. At Colorado, McClain was a scholarship player from day one, ready to go and viewed as a superstar, and things didn't work out. Florida has not handled it the same way, and be it because it wanted to make him prove himself, or simply because it didn't have enough roster spots on its scholarship roster in order to accommodate him, we're not entirely sure. But the reality is this: Cormani McClain is not on scholarship to begin his Florida career. He is a preferred walk-on who is being compensated via NIL. But that is a benchmark and a milestone that he can now work towards. You want to become a scholarship player, you need to check X, Y, and Z boxes and be able to move forward from some of the things that maybe have led to some criticism, be it from coaches or from other onlookers regarding his past. And so between a very highly spoken of culture that Billy Napier is very confident in, as well as having a system of some sort of reward here to help foster Cormani McClain's growth, irrespective of what's going on at Colorado, I do think that Florida is in a good position in order to be able to help a young player realize his potential and maximize the talent that I think everybody is well aware that he has.
Yeah, I kind of feel like it's the latter a little bit, just where Florida's scholarship numbers are. You've posted the scholarship chart a whole bunch over at Swamp247, where members can go check that out. But as we've talked about and written about, Florida's right there at the cap. But in this day and age, that's not really as big of a problem as it used to be, especially with NIL, because you have the opportunity, based on how healthy your program's affiliated NIL fund is, where you can go after players when you're over the cap and be able to get them to commit to your program, knowing that, yes, they may be a walk-on for 1-2 semesters, a scholarship spot may be available to them down the line, but they're going to be able to have that made up where they're not, paying out of pocket on their, mom and dad's dime to enroll at the state of Florida, at the University of Florida. I also think that, in-state tuition at the University of Florida is certainly one of the cheapest places in the country when it comes to public universities, and hasn't really changed too much over the last couple of decades. And I think that Cormani McClain, being a kid from the state of Florida, certainly helped Florida's pitch to being a preferred walk-on as well. But I do also agree there's an element of proving it there for him, because when, like we just talked about, when there are certainly some insinuations, accusations of not taking things very seriously, not, walking a fine line when he was at Colorado, that I certainly think could have contributed to that. But overall, I don't think it's any one factor. I think that there are certainly several reasons here that allowed Florida to land this kid as a preferred walk-on and a former 5-star prospect. You don't see that too often. You certainly didn't see it 3-4 years ago before NIL, but now it is absolutely a realistic possibility. And it's not really even the first time that we have seen it in the past month. Jason Zandamela, number one interior offensive lineman in the class of 2024 by 247 Sports. I think it's absolutely possible that he begins his career at Florida as a preferred walk-on, just based on how some things shake out from a scholarship standpoint with the rest of their roster here. So it certainly is something that programs can take advantage of. And I think it speaks to the health of the state of Florida's, the University of Florida's NIL fund right now. One more thing I do want to discuss, because this has kind of become, and I brought up Jason, this has become, I think, a little bit apparent as of late, that Florida has done two things very well in my mind. They've been able to land former players that they've recruited and maybe finish second for, whether it's Jameer Grimsley, DeAndre Robinson, Grayson Pup Howard, Cormani McClain now. They've been able to get them in when those players have sought a new home, but they also have been able to land multiple players now who are ranked number one at their position by 247 Sports. DJ Lagway, number one quarterback in the class by 247. LJ McCray, number one defensive lineman. Jason Zandamela, number one interior offensive lineman. And now they get Cormani McClain, the number one cornerback in the class of 2023. I know that there's maybe this perception out there that the Florida program is in a quote unquote bad place right now, or that players don't want to come and play at a place where maybe a coach may not be there in 6-7 months, where his future remains to be seen. And then they're looking for a new home, or they're playing for a new coach, whatever it is. But I think that this recent recruiting process that Florida has been able to pull off when it comes to landing highly ranked guys or getting players back who finished second to them, they finished second to in the previous class, I think that kind of flies in the face with that narrative. Am I off base here, or am I overlooking the fact that they've been able to land so many high profile, highly ranked players, no matter whether it's at their high school level or in the transfer portal. What do you make of that, and how much do you think it really helps the optics here for Florida's recruiting? Because they're going to have to pull together a highly ranked recruiting class as well, because that is certainly something you have to do year in, year out if you're a coach that wants to achieve the rebuild that Billy Napier is looking to pull off.
I mean, we've known for some time, and you and I have even discussed it on this podcast, that Billy Napier is a good recruiter, and he has proven that, on several occasions. And whether that is, happening at the outset of the recruiting process in high school, and they're bringing guys in like they did with DJ Lagway and LJ McCray and a couple others who have been, Eugene Wilson, really highly recruited and then ultimately fantastic players. Or like you mentioned, they're going back and guys pick other schools and enroll. They realize that that's not the best fit for them. The Grayson Howards and the DeAndre Robinsons and Jameer Grimsleys, even Cormani McClains of the world. And then they go back and they, win out these, so to speak, second recruitments. And Florida has been able to assemble a roster that I think is easily its most impressive so far under the Billy Napier, regime. And a lot of it is via its ability to do exactly that. Billy is a smart recruiter, and I think that he has done a good job of utilizing that in terms of his ability to develop relationships with parents. He has mentioned on several occasions that a big factor in his ability to win both at the high school and transfer level is how he and his staff members relate to the parents. It's not just recruiting the player, he says. It's recruiting the parents. It's recruiting the family. It's recruiting on occasions former coaches. Jason Zandamela is a good example of a guy who took a visit to the University of Florida and brought his former high school coach with him. He's not terribly far removed from his high school career. Florida recruited him as a high schooler and had a relationship with his coach, and it was able to leverage that to some degree when it was recruiting him for a second time as a transfer at USC. And so I do think that it's good for Florida. I think anybody who follows this program would tell you that this is more the expectation than some sort of true benefit here. I think that Florida is expected to be among the top 10 to 8 schools in the country in terms of talent acquisition, whether that's at the transfer or high school level. It doesn't really matter. The composite recruiting that they're doing is expected to be very good. And it has been. And now really it's just a matter of turning it into wins. And I've said that before on this podcast as well. I think that recruiting is great, but it is only as strong as your win and loss record indicates. And Florida is, in reality, 11-14 overall and 6-10 in the SEC over the last 2 years. I think that this has as good a chance as it has had over those 2 years to improve upon that. I think that Florida is as well positioned as it could be with the schedule that it is going to face in 2024 in order to be able to take a step up on the win-loss total. But again, it will be that result that speaks to just how good the recruiting is, because again, recruiting is only as strong as your execution with it. And so, yes, it is a benefit to Florida that it has as much talent as it has in the fold. And now it becomes a question of what exactly is it going to do with it.
Now, before we get out of here, we have to talk about the potential of Florida adding a little bit more talent to their ranks before the season arrives. Not only did Florida have Cormani McClain on campus for an official visit, but they hosted Elijhah Badger, the former Arizona State pass catcher, who certainly has had a lot of production throughout his career. He left shortly after Cormani McClain did today. Jacob, I know you've got an update on Elijhah Badger that you would like to share. What are you hearing from that front, and how do you view Florida here as a player in his recruitment?
Yeah, not necessarily too much here to update, but I can tell you this, that as of us recording this at 4 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesday, which is shortly after Elijhah Badger left Florida's campus, he is not committed to any school. He is not committed to Florida. He is also not committed to Washington or Arizona. If I had to list some finalists at this point, at this late stage in his recruitment process, I would say that it is a 2-team race between Florida and Arizona. Arizona has had some solid momentum. Its wide receivers coach, Bobby Wade, was a former Arizona State assistant, so he's familiar with Badger, and Badger is familiar with him. I would say that, it could also come down to what the NIL packages are from each of these schools, as is the case in most recruitments nowadays. But I do think a decision is imminent, and I think that we could see that by the end of this week. Friday or Saturday is a pretty reasonable timeline, so I've heard, to learn what Elijhah Badger's decision is going to be. But the Gators feel like they're in a good spot. They did as much as they thought they could throughout his visit. They feel as though they established a strong connection. Badger had some family in town alongside him, and it seems as though Florida was able to establish a connection with his family members as well. And the sentiment is that, Florida's a good place for him to continue his career. And in a similar way that Ricky Pearsall was able to maybe kind of balloon his prospects for the NFL level and show the world that he is capable of hanging with the most talented college football players in the country in the SEC. And that is an attractive thing for him. And so, I think we still stand to see how things shake out here. There's still time. I think it's not a battle that is over, but I do think that Florida is among the schools that'll make a final push for him. And my understanding is that his visit went quite well.
Yeah, he spent a little bit more time in Gainesville on this trip than Cormani McClain did, even though McClain took those 2 trips dating back to Friday of last week and the official visit between Tuesday and Wednesday here. Elijah got into town on Monday night, maybe had a chance to see campus a little bit early before his visit began on Tuesday. And then, like I mentioned, left campus a little bit after Cormani McClain. So we'll definitely be looking for an update and have that over at Swamp247 here as he makes his decision. It's going to be, I think, a really intriguing decision, especially when you look at Florida's overall need for pass catching talent right now, looking for some production to add to that roster. So we will definitely have, like I said, a lot of discussion and coverage over that at Swamp247. Jacob does a great job covering all things transfer portal, among a million other things, as does Blake Alderman. So we definitely, like I said, are going to have that over there. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 podcast. We'll be back pretty soon, absolutely. Most likely to discuss baseball, where Florida is heading to Georgia this weekend to wrap up the regular season. Jacob has done a fantastic job covering that. I implore you to go read his story on Jack Caglione. It was a fantastic read if you haven't checked it out already. But like I said, that's going to do it for Graham Hall and Jacob Rudner. We'll see you next time.